Welcome. I'm Reverend Dr. José Miguel Román, and I'm spiritual counsel here at United Palace of Spiritual Arts. And today, of course, we are together once again as community with open heart conversations, where we assemble once a month, usually the last Sunday of the month, and we explore from an open heart and with an open mind the world's enduring spiritual and religious traditions. And today I am so extremely happy that I am once again joined by our spiritual director and chief executive officer, Reverend Heather Shea.
Thank you, Jose. It's wonderful being here. And Wendy, thank you for joining us. We're delighted. Looking forward to today.
Absolutely. And today is a fascinating spirituality that we will be exploring, Wicca. I'll begin by saying that Wicca is not an easy spiritual tradition to define. Unlike many other paths, Wicca has never had a central authority to define its beliefs and practices. So just about anything I say will prove potentially uncomfortable to some Wiccan practitioners, who, of course, have the right to define their path. So I say that what I'm about to share with you with a little bit of trepidation, and the hope that folks will understand that this is just a very basic outline. Some things will resonate with folks and some things will not. We can begin by saying that many scholars think of Wicca as a predominantly Western movement. Many of its followers have been deeply influenced by some of the following. First, a deep reverence for the power and majesty of nature. Some would call Wicca an earth-based religious tradition. In some of its forms, Wicca is deeply rooted in a sense of both God and goddess. Some Wiccan practice traditions that are influenced by ancient forms of what I refer to as witchcraft or magic. Many Wiccans accept the so-called Wiccan Rede as an ethical code, which states, "If it harm none, do what you will." Practices in Wiccan communities include forms of prayer, meditation, nature contemplation, and worship, and communal celebrations and rituals throughout the year, celebrating the new and full moon, as well as the vernal equinox, summer solstice, and Halloween, which they call Samhain. Wiccan rituals include the invoking the aid of deities and other powers, and practicing ceremonial magic and sharing ritual meals. Wicca is seen as a path based on pre-Christian traditions of Northern and Western Europe. Am I correct in all of that?
You are correct in all of that.
And today, to walk us through this magnificent conversation is someone very near and dear to me personally, Reverend Wendy Van Allen. And it is such a pleasure and an honor to have you here, Wendy. Wendy is especially important to me because we were classmates in seminary. And so it's such a real pleasure to have you here. Reverend Wendy is the registrar and the director of student services at One Spirit, where she was ordained as an inter-spiritual minister in 2014 and completed the interspiritual counseling program in 2019. She received her bachelor's degree in anthropology from Rutgers University. Wendy's spiritual path began at a very early age. She was raised as an Episcopalian with a strong interest in metaphysical, indigenous, and earth-based traditions. She has over 30 years of initiation as a Wiccan priestess in 3 separate traditions, and was initiated as an Olorisha in the Lukumi faith, Santeria, as the daughter of Obatala in 2012. She is a practicing spiritist, a certified intuitive consultant, and a spiritual director. Wendy is active in social and environmental concerns. She and her partner Chris have founded Soul Blossom Center, right? A center of earth-based tradition and healing in Kingston, New York, which you'll tell us a little bit more about as the conversation continues. So Wendy, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here today, Jose. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
It's good to be here.
Welcome.
And so, Wendy, I would love to begin, but I know that with a question that Reverend Shea has for you. But I know you said you wanted to sort of bring us into the right space, so I'll give you that.
Yes, I thought today, instead of just talking about dry ancient tradition, which kind of led to the Reconstruction tradition that we're calling Wicca today, thought I would read a poem that I wrote to the goddess many moons ago, back when I was initiated. And it's called Corn Mother, and it's dedicated to the American goddess. Grandmother, our mother, Tonantzin, she who gives birth, changing one. You whose face is found everywhere. Pachamama, lady of growing things. Mama Cocha, she of the ocean waves. Mama Quilla, golden mother of all life. As you change your feathered robes and show your ripening belly, and the Lord of Light passes into the grain, I walk with you, loving all that you are, and in doing so, as you are all loving me. Blessed be.
Blessed be.
That was lovely. That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to all of you who are joining us today. This is the United Palace of Spiritual Art, and we call ourselves the home of spiritual artistry, and that indeed was a brilliant expression of spiritual artistry and connecting with the spirit in a beautiful artistic way. So thank you for bringing that forth today. Tell me, what attracted you to Wicca?
So I have always been attracted to everything to do with magic, ever since I was a very small child. I want to say 4 or 5 years old, starting kindergarten. Songs about witches, songs about anything to do with Halloween. It just is, as long as I can remember, anything to do with witchcraft, the occult, magic, mysticism was something that I was attracted to, and I would take all the books out of the library, and there was the librarian in our town in New Jersey where I grew up once said to my mother, you know, your daughter takes all these scary books out. And my mother, being the open-minded woman that she was, she said, that's okay. You know, she never discouraged our being, even though, you know, we did go to church, we were Episcopalian, but my mother believed in all the same things. I mean, she was from Puerto Rico, and my mother was raised by a spiritist, my grandmother, and we were open to this, to those concepts. And my mother was also very much into nature, so that love and that passion for the earth and for nature was kind of what I grew up with.
That's wonderful. I had something similar, that my family's from Iceland, was very much growing up where it was acceptable, it was normal, connected to nature. So we're kind of blessed in that way to have that experience at home where it's accepted when people are saying your child's taking some interesting books out, or why are they interested in that? If you're, in my case, I was brought up Lutheran. We hear about the term Wicca, and you kind of mentioned there's some interest in how to define it. What is Wicca? What does that really mean, and where did it come from?
So Wicca is a earth-based tradition. It's a nature religion, and it's a reconstruction. Wicca is pagan. Neo-pagan is the correct term, and pagans are modern people who embrace pre-Christian religions. Like you said, it's very much based in the northern hemisphere. Most of the traditions, Celtic tradition, a lot of the Teutonic faiths. And I really think the most important aspects of Wicca that are attractive to most people are the idea of, first of all, your connection to nature. And nature is basically the goddess, is the idea of the feminine face of God. And the people of before Christianity happened, there were indigenous people everywhere. Mm-hmm. And you know, when I was at the Parliament of World Religions last year, and we were there together, right. I listened to a man. His name was Blair Stonechild. He was an indigenous man from First Nations in Canada, and he gave a lecture on the indigenous traditions of the Americas and his people. And he coined a phrase, he either coined it or I learned it from him. And he said, the indigenous people of the planet all received the original instructions from Creator. That's what they believe. And to me, that really says why it's so important, why so many people are attracted to pagan tradition, because it is basically reverence for the earth, reverence for nature, and your connection to your ancestors. And that's basically what Wicca is. It's getting back in touch with an ancestral link that basically the years and years of patriarchal religion and Christianity and other traditions kind of buried that, and they buried it in a lot of harsh ways. So, and it started around the late 19th century, and really in the early 20th century. Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente and Doreen Virtue, these people were the original writers of a lot of what we have as liturgy. And they created this tradition based on what they knew of ceremonial magic and legends and folklore and traditions of European people. So it isn't unbroken. It may be based in ancient tradition, but it's something that has been reconstructed since basically around the 1960s, the late 60s and the early 70s. I think Wicca started a lot with consciousness raising for and it has to do a lot with women's spirituality, which brings me to the goddess.
It's interesting because the history that I've read suggests that exactly as you said, Wicca it is a reconstructed faith in many ways. It began mostly in England, it seems, in the 1950s, post-World War II England. And then it was in the 1960s that it was sort of retransplanted here in the United States because of the interest in sort of non-traditional lifestyles, spirituality,
feminism,
and feminism. Absolutely correct. Because the two things that you said that I thought were really fascinating, and that is that Wicca connects us to two really fascinating things. One is a radically different experience and relationship to nature. And the second is a radically different relationship with the feminine divine. So let's speak to one of those, relationship to nature. How is that different? How is nature perceived differently within the Wiccan tradition?
Practicing witches, because we are witches, connect through nature because we connect through the seasons and the cycles of nature. For instance, one aspect of Wicca is getting together for the new moon and the full moon.
Right.
And why do we do that? Because they bring in different cycles of our life. Paying attention to the seasons. You know, each season is a different part of our inner self and our inner seasons, and also the outer seasons. Remember, these traditions go back pre-Christian, pre-history, to when agriculture was everything.
Right.
Pre-industrial. If the crops failed, people died. Whole communities would disappear. So reverence for the earth and understanding of that interconnectedness, that we are not separate from nature. We are not outside of nature. The Creator didn't give us this to exploit. We are nothing without Mother Earth.
Right.
And once again, to connect it back to indigenous tradition here, the concept of Mother Earth being mother to us all, giving us everything. We can't breathe all of the elements, earth, air, fire, and water. Those basic elements of life are within us, and we wouldn't be here without them.
Thank you for explaining reconstructed, because when you were mentioning reconstructed, I'm thinking it's going back, but 1960 is kind of current to me, all things considered. So it is a rebirthing or
rebirthing is a good word. Yes,
a refocusing and reemerging, which is lovely, which is happening with the divine feminine. Now, when I think of the great goddesses and even Mother Earth, I don't think of that as a witch. And again, I'm fascinated. That's another word that I know people go, oh, they're witches. Explain witches and warlocks and how that term works. And
it goes back to the idea that Wicca, the reconstruction, is a revisioning of the traditions that were buried by the Christian church. And these were traditions based on earth worship, on nature worship, on seasonal practices, on healing, on understanding of plants and animals. You have to go back into prehistory to really understand that. If you think about prehistory, we think about hunters-gatherers, right? Mm-hmm. And as we know, the hunting side tends to be the male-dominated, male aspect of humanity. But the gathering part sometimes gets lost in the importance of that. What things were important to women? What did we learn from women? Women probably were responsible for everything from language, raising the children, to gathering of stories, to telling stories, to learning the difference between a weed and a crop and poison and domesticating animals. All of those things probably fell under women's rights. So these were practices that lasted forever. In the Middle Ages, when there was actually persecution of these practices between like the 13th century and the 18th century, those practices became associated with witchcraft. And that's where the word witch comes in. Witch is actually from the Germanic traditions, from the Teutonics, and it means wise one. It's from Wicca, which is the wise ones, and that's where that language comes from.
So I remember a lot of my reading suggested that in many ways the opposition to witches really was born out of the fact that it was witches who mastered, if you will, early medicine. They were the ones who actually discovered through, as gatherers, it was women, if you will, what specific herbs were good for headaches, what were good for that stomach aches. And as medicine evolved, what happened was they saw that as a competition. And so all of a sudden witches became evil. And women, if you will, that had to be sort of eliminated. You eliminate the competition. And that's all of a sudden when this magnificent wisdom was extinguished, if you will, in the West. Isn't that true?
That is absolutely correct. During that period, and again, it was the rise of patriarchal tradition, and we don't want to just say it was only Christians, because there was plenty of patriarchy in pagan tradition by that time, in the Greeks and the Romans. But what happened was this transfer of power. And women at that time in traditional society, and again, in indigenous society, women were the keeper of the knowledge, and they were the keeper of herb craft. They were the keeper of what's poison, what's not poison. They were the keeper of giving birth. And think of the power of giving birth, okay? What herbs to take to have a baby, what herbs to take to not have a baby. Now, today, we are still having that battle over our own bodies, about how, when and when not to have a baby. That was the traditional work of the wise woman and the midwives. And in those times, and they have many estimates of how many people died, but it was perhaps not 9 million as what some people have said. I don't think it was that many, but it was hundreds of thousands of people were murdered by the church. In those, and a lot of it was because of this fear of this knowledge and this traditional wisdom that women had, and they basically handed it down. And I don't think it was organized towards the end. By the time the Middle Ages, all of these things became tradition and folklore. They were no longer religions as it was in earlier times of the great goddess. But the great goddess is, as you were saying, Heather, the great goddess has been around since the dawn of time. And over time, it's an archetype that's in our brains and hardwired to have a feminine face of God. So when the 60s happened, which is when it really took off, I think, paganism and witchcraft and Wicca, was this need that we had to really acknowledge the feminine face of God in a way that wasn't whitewashed by the church, because for a long time Mary was that in Europe. Mary became that. She absorbed all of the ancient goddesses.
Right. Or
the saints. Like, for instance, in Ireland, which is a very pagan place, my father's ancestors come from there. All of the pagan goddesses became saints, like
like
Saint Bridget.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's, that really sounds wonderful, and it's the connection to the goddesses and the evolution of Mary, and now we've become witches who cast spells and are scary. What happened there, or how did that happen? And why are witches scary? Perhaps, I mean, there's, when you talk about the media or all those books and Halloween, it's scary time. So
Witches are scary because they represent women that have not submitted to the authority of the patriarchy.
that's scary.
That's scary. And during those times, it was the nun was the positive face of the feminine religious woman, or the mother, who is absolutely the wife and submissive to her husband. But the woman who wouldn't submit and would be the one who had the wisdom of the herbs and the wisdom of the moon and the power to make things happen, where people would go for guidance and counseling. These people the midwife was more than just a medical doctor. She was the counselor. She was their therapist. People would go and talk to them. And that was frightening. That was outside of the church's power. And at that time, the church wanted to control everything. So that became like the shadow. The witch is the shadow. And she holds all that energy. And that's where the fear comes from.
Would it be appropriate to say that to a Wiccan, the earth, nature, is alive? It isn't a dead rock. It's not. It's living.
So one of my favorite witches, Phyllis Carrot, who teaches at One Spirit, she recently did a class on the goddess, and she said the goddess is not something you worship outside of yourself. The goddess is an experience, and that experience is really nature. Because, yes, is nature alive? Is that tree outside alive? If you want to feel her, just go out and grab some dirt. Go and hug a tree, go into a cave. Yes, nature is alive. Nature is a sentient being. It is a higher consciousness than us, a different consciousness than us. It's a universal consciousness. And there's no doubt about it because it's all around us. So it's not even a matter of believing, it's a matter of being aware of it.
So taking that as sort of the basis of a nature-based religion, this deep reverence and understanding of the living element of nature, what are other beliefs that Wiccan adhere to?
So the traditions I've been, there's many different Wiccan traditions. They range from all different types of pantheons. So you have Celtic witches, you have Gardnerian witches, you have Alexandrian witches, and you have a lot of eclectic witches. Many witches, most forms of Wicca not only have goddess, but they also revere an idea of God. That's important. God is seen to us as also in three, like kind of different, three main concepts. So there's the idea of Father God, right? The sun. Yeah. Ra would be a great example in the Egyptian pantheon. And the solar deity that is born at the winter solstice and dies later when it's reborn. That's the archetype of the Christ is a solar deity.
Yes.
But there's also the vegetation god. The idea of God as vegetation. The green man is a great archetype. The fertile seeding of nature is the idea of God, right? Is that vegetation god. Again, it's a dying and being reborn, that constant cycle of nature. One deity that I'm thinking of would be Tammuz, which comes from the ancient Sumerian traditions. And then there's the idea of God as the horned god. God is the god of the animals, which is a very ancient form of God. And that god basically represents the archetype of the hunter and the hunted one. And there's images of him going back to prehistoric times in caves in France. There's images of him on cauldrons that they've dug out of bogs. There's something called the Gunstrip cauldron. And he has horns. And, that's a fearful thing in of Wicca, is the horned god, the idea of this horny god.
So we have not yet gone into the theater, into the United Palace of Spiritual Arts. And again, all of you who have not been here, we invite you to come in as well. But you'll see on the walls, we have a lot of green men, which I love. And we have a lot of different natural settings of corn and of all sorts of different gods and god-like creatures or mythical creatures. So you'll feel very much at home in there. But I particularly like the green men. I connect with them as I go by. You just mentioned another one of those great words. Do witches have cauldrons?
Witches do have cauldrons. I have a cauldron.
What's a cauldron?
A cauldron it's a symbol. Much of Wicca and pagan tradition is tapping into these archetypes that are really important. The cauldron represents the goddess's womb, and it's where transformation happens. It's where we, where we mix up our brews and our potions. I like making potions. Potions, what are they? You asked me about spells before. Spells are Christian scientists have their own form of spells. They cast these affirmative praying, where you are basically setting your intention, and your intention, you put it out, you invoke the creative power of God, goddess, you name what it is that you're bringing into being, you release whatever's standing in the way of you achieving that, and you name what it is that you so desire. And that's what a spell is. It's invoking that power. And in the cauldron is where it happens. Not all witches use cauldrons, but I do.
Beautiful. Tell me, you'd mentioned virtue in her text. What are some of the other texts? Because that's at 1960s, a fairly, call it a sacred text. It's from 1960. What are some of the other texts that you
about
refer
text,
to?
I think the most, there's plenty of books on Wicca that I would recommend. Janet and Stuart Farrar wrote The Witch's God and The Witch's Goddess, and they wrote The Eighth Sabbath for Witches, and these go back to the 80s, and they're great books on the real foundational literature. Witchcraft Today by Gerald Gardner is one of the early ones as well. Doreen Virtue wrote some excellent books on the holidays of nature, the practice of our tradition, and what we do. And what we do is basically we tap into nature to, it's a very practical tradition. So you basically align yourself with the rhythms of nature to help yourself in your life and to help others and to help the earth. And we do that by, working with stones. We do that with working with herbs. We do that working with water. We do that working with fire. A lot of witches are into crystals, and many are into what I would call shamanic practices.
Right.
These are shamanic practices, and the sense shaman with a small s being that's an anthropological term, which basically means that it's a different way of thinking. There's a different logic to it, and things like attracts like is really important. So you would work on something, and you would, if you wanted to say, do a healing ceremony for somebody. A like attracts like spell would be, you would bring in healing herbs, and you might stuff a poppet with their image on it, filled with herbs, and then you would put that in a place that you could sit with it and send energy to that, and that would be a good example of a spell. And it's about intention, and it's about having faith that it's going to come together, and I can tell you it works. It's very practical.
Oh, absolutely.
We are the old people, we are the new people, we are the same people, wiser than before. We are the same people, wiser than before.
You mentioned the word shamanism, and a lot of people are very fascinated by shamanism these days. What's the difference between, because you mentioned shaman with a small s. People say, oh, I'm a shaman. People say, oh, you're a shaman, Heather. I'm like, no, I'm not a shaman. So that's my definition. But how would you define what a shaman is versus somebody who practices Wicca or witches? And again, there are similarities.
Yes,
but I think that would be helpful.
Similarities.
And there's differences.
I think, as we started with, Wicca is a religion. It is a tradition. Shamanism, with a capital S, I refer to as the practice of the indigenous people. I think they're from the Inuit people, but they that is the name of their medicine person. But a shaman with a small s, I clarify that being that it's an anthropological term to reference certain practices that indigenous traditions practice everywhere. There's not really a better word for it, because the shaman is not only the medicine person, they're the person who's going to perform healing.
Correct.
They're the person that people go to for counseling in their community. They're the person that is the wise person to advise the chiefs or the kings or the leaders as to their course of action. They do divination. They read dreams. They travel in spirit. These were all things witches were accused of, right?
Right.
The idea of riding on your broomstick,
Yep.
right? What was that? What is that all about? Why is that such a powerful idea? Well, what they know about those times is that a lot of these, the witches' formulas that they would mix up had a lot of hallucinogenic type drugs in there that they would rub with bear's fat on themselves, and they would go into a trance and they would travel and they would fly.
Right.
And they would go to the other world, and that's what shamanism is. It's a separate reality that you connect with. So I think that Wicca is a way, it's a pathway that incorporates a lot of shamanic tradition or practices to allow people to step out of this reality to connect with the spirit world.
Do you feel that you've been able to do that through your practices? Do you feel that there are times in your practices when you have been able to connect, if you will, to a world beyond this world or a world next to this world?
I was always born with that gift.
You were.
I all my life I've had vision. I've always had experiences of the spirit world. I've had a near-death experience when I was 4. And these are the kind of things that people who call themselves shamans, like a real shaman doesn't call himself a shaman,
Right.
but it's an initiatory experience. And yes, with the practices that a lot of witches perform, drumming, raising energy in circle, chanting, singing, dancing, those are ways, those are methods to get themselves into a state where you're going to connect with the other world, which is just on the other side of us.
Right.
We have a deep belief in that world, most of us, that this is just one side of reality, that there's multiple realities.
And in many ways, that's really what we talk about when we talk about spiritual artistry. It may be in a different term, but when somebody is praying or singing and dancing, we're seeing a great concert or perhaps a movie. They have a connection to something more, something connected, something soul connection of something greater. And we may not put it in those terms, but it is that creation with the divine male or female divine.
And I think Heather, that what you just said is the key to that experience is creativity, is intuition, is the artist is a form of shamanism as far as I'm concerned. People that create, that follow that kind of energy, that leading, because it really is a more powerful form of imagination, I want to say. But it's essential. And I think a lot of what our materialist culture has stripped from us, because, let's face it, after the Enlightenment, we kind of did away with a lot of superstition for good reason. I mean, there was good reason. A lot of these the olden times, people did have human sacrifices. They did do evil things. And there was a lot of war and there was a lot of ignorance. But they threw away that connection to this mystical side. And it's discouraged in our culture. It's ridiculed. But it's a deep hunger because it's in our brains.
So do say more, then I'll go back to say more, because I do believe in we'll call it, it's a Harry Potter term, the dark magic, But talk a little bit about, because sometimes there is the darker side, or are there bad spells or evil spells, or.
So I think that points to the morality that guides us. Wicca is a life-affirming tradition. It really is about affirming our will in a positive way. So there isn't a lot of negative baggage. We are not some people that have thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. There is no Bible Okay, our sacred text is the earth. It's like connect with nature, and nature will teach you what you need to know. But the Wiccan Rede is what is our morality, and that really says, "By the Wiccan law ye must, in perfect love, in perfect trust. 8 words the Wiccan Rede fulfill, and ye harm none, do what ye will, lest in thyself defense it be. Ever mind the rule of 3. Follow this with mind and heart, and merry ye meet, and merry ye part." And what that basically means is that this is a universe of free will, and we govern our own choices, but karma governs that. And again, using a term from another tradition, karma is karma. We believe in karma. What you put out there comes back to you. Do people do evil things? Are people jealous? Do they gossip? Everybody does. I think it's naive to say there's only good witches, and that's a bunch of crap as far as I'm concerned. There's people that do get into these kinds of traditions because it gives them a sense of power. Get like, oh, I'm powerful now. I'm going to work magic. I'm going to do this, and sometimes that could definitely backfire. So things like love magic gets into the gray area because, I fell in love with so-and-so. And I know when I was younger, I practiced a couple of those, and it backfires because they don't really love you. You might be controlling them for a little while, but it comes back to you, anything where you're going to try to control another person, their will, trying to manipulate things that really you have no business doing. So it really does come back to wisdom, is like making the right choice. What is the right thing that's for the good of all and the harm of none, which is something that we end our spells with a lot.
It's interesting because in many ways, every religious and spiritual tradition has its shadow side.
Yep.
Not just Wicca. Isn't that true?
That is really true. But I think that's what's important about our tradition is that we don't get into it's all white or it's all black. We are a tradition that believes in balance.
Right.
Just, balance is the most important thing that we can achieve in our lifetimes today. And as you mentioned, I'm also a Lukumi priestess. And again, in that tradition, it's about balance. It's not about, everything does have its light in the dark. And that's really been the problem with patriarchy and with what happened with the Christian religion, is they insist so much on everything's positive and light about us. Well, what did they do? They turned around and demonized everything that wasn't them. And one of them was the horned god, right? Became the devil. And anything that is not of the book is evil and bad. And, it's throughout the Bible. And that's a problem because we are not all good. We're not all evil. We are a combination of both, and we're human beings that are here to evolve. And Wicca really is about practically working with nature in a practical way to help ourselves and our community and the earth and other sentient beings, other creatures, right. But when people do get on power trips and they do negative things, there's a built-in law, and it does come back to them. And I've seen it. I've practiced this tradition for 30 years, and there was a time when I actually stepped away from it for a little while because of people that were on power trips and on control and a lot of things that they would practice. There's a lot of people that would have these things called witch wars, and we could go into that, but
right.
What are some of your practices? What are some of the things that you've spoken, for example, of cauldron and spells, so that's part of the practice. What are other practices that Wiccan practitioners will do individually or collectively?
Well, just to clarify, like I said before, a spell really to us is a form of prayer. It's a form of prayer, for one. Wiccans gather together at different times of the year. We gather for 8 major holidays.
What are those?
Those would be, it starts the year with Samhain, which is our Halloween. And that is the holiday of the dead, holiday to honor your ancestors, to honor the dead of the land, to honor the ancients of our tradition. And that's the reason that we associate it with ghosts and things like that is because we believe that that's where the veil of the year is very thin, that spirit can come and go at that time. So that's the beginning of our year, and that's at Halloween. And then, in other traditions, it's El Dia de los Muertos.
Yeah,
It's
a
the
Mexican
same
holiday, yeah.
idea,
Yep.
It's honoring, and why do we honor it at that time? Because that's when the earth, at least in the northern hemisphere, goes under, right? It goes into winter, so
And
it
by the
brings
way,
winter in.
In the Christian tradition, it's recognized during the same time, and
That's
it's
right.
called All Hallows Day, right?
It's called All Souls and All Saints,
Souls,
and
yeah.
they put that there for the very reason because all the pagans were celebrating at that time anyway.
Right,
So
right.
what they did, the more successful way of fighting the pagan traditions was to incorporate them
Incorporate
into the
it.
Catholic calendar. And then after that, we have Yule, which is the holiday that's the winter solstice.
Again,
That's-
during Christmas.
that's
right?
Christmas. So many of the Christian, what we call Christian secular ideas are from pagan tradition, like Santa Claus, and the evergreen tree is the bringing in of nature that's always there. The lights, because it's a light holiday, it's a solar holiday that reminds us the light will return. So a lot of what we celebrate at Christmas time comes from pagan tradition. After that, it would be Imbolc, which is February 2nd. In the ancient calendar, that was the time of the beginning of the lambing, or the beginning of the quickening of nature, when they say that the sap runs back up in the trees. And that's when nature is going to change, and it's going to begin the springtime, which would be the following the holiday, which is the spring equinox. And that's called Litha. Litha is also known as Ostara, which gives us the word for Easter. And she is the goddess of the Easter eggs and the bunny rabbits, and all of that stuff is from the pagan tradition. So the goddess of the new green earth. The next holiday would be a very important one, which is opposite of Samhain, which is Beltane. It's named for the ancient god of the sun in many different cultures. In the north, he was known as Bel. In the south, he was known as Baal. And of course, the ancient Jews and the ancient Christians really try to push his worship down, but he was a sun god, fire god. And that ceremony, they used to have, and to this day, they still raise maypoles in Europe. It's a fertility celebration. Fertility, again, is so important to the people of the past, because we had to have, you have to remember in those days that if you had 10 kids and 2 survived, you were lucky. So fertility was really important to the ancestors.
Can we stop there? Because there is always this perception that among Wiccans, there's a really radically different understanding and experience of sex and sexuality. Some Wiccans, for example, I know will practice some of their rituals in the nude, for example. Sexuality is just seen and experienced differently. Can you speak a little bit to that?
I absolutely could. It is seen and experienced differently. One of the most powerful weapons the patriarchy has used against humans is shame. Shaming us for who we are, shaming us for the way we're born, for being sexual with one another, for women's beauty, and that the attraction to lust, the idea of lust. So in pagan tradition, we honor nature, and sex is part of nature, and it's not a bad thing. So sexuality is embraced, and it's for some pagans and some witches that it's really a big part of their ceremonies. And we celebrate all forms of sexuality. And what I've seen in the last 30-something years in Wicca and paganism is an evolution of even forms of gender identity. And it's kind of refreshing, actually. There's a group out of Pennsylvania, Stone Circle Wicca, that was formed at Four Quarters, which is an interfaith earth-based sanctuary out there. And their form of Wicca has not only God and Goddess are invoked, but so are all and non-binary. The concept of people that are gender fluid. And I think that's fantastic, because it's true. There isn't just really 2 forms of sexuality or gender. There's people that are both, and
Multiplicity,
people
yeah.
that
And
are
that are
none,
none, correct,
and that's
yeah.
what they celebrate.
And
Stone
that's
Circle
also true in
Wicca.
nature.
And that's true in nature,
Absolutely right.
exactly. So, sex is something that we see as a celebration of life. But again, going back to the Wiccan read, I think that and ye harm none, do what ye will means you need to have some self-control.
Could you re-say, because there was the thing you talked about, do no harm. If you could just recite that again, because that was so beautiful, and I want to make sure that we really emphasize that in this program.
The idea of, and ye harm none, do what ye will, lest in thyself defense it be. Ever mind the rule of three. And what that means is live, enjoy life, embrace life. Embrace all life that has to offer. But be ever mind, if you are harming someone else, including yourself, then it's not something that's good for you, and it's not good for others. And so it keeps you to remember. It helps us to remember that we must always be mindful of ourselves and others. And I think that goes along with what we're talking about with sex, is a lot of times people can get in trouble with sex.
Absolutely.
Too much of anything, whether it's food. And this is, being, a tradition that embraces sensuality and everything from all different appetites, let's say. I know a lot of pagan people that may become a problem, or it might be food, it might be, for me it was substances, and for me I had to give that up in the end, and that helped me to retool myself. But
it's interesting because you began not by talking about sexuality. It's interesting that as a Wiccan priestess, you began by talking about the unbelievably important sense of balance. That Wiccan was grounded in this deep, deep, deep reverence for balance. And literally a level of balance that was overwhelming. Balance of dark and light, and balance of shadow, and all of it balanced. So in many ways that speaks to then also the perspective on sexuality, which is truly embracing it, loving it, celebrating it from a place of balance. Would you agree?
Exactly. Embracing our inner as a female, embracing my inner male, embracing for men, embracing their feminine side. Oh, how much does this earth need that? For men to be in touch with their feminine side and be okay with it, to be gentle, to be loving, to be nurturing, for women to be strong, so all of that, that balance. And again, there's a saying in the craft, it says, as above, so below. Okay. We are a microcosm of the macrocosm. So everything that we have now, who we are, is reflected in the earth. And what's happening now, and this is why it's so important that these traditions are being rebirthed and reborn, is our earth is out of balance. Our earth is screaming at us. It is being flooded, and that is a serious thing. Global climate change is a perfect example of the end result of patriarchal thinking, that man is dominant over the earth. It's just this inert matter that we can use and abuse to our heart's content, that, the elements, it doesn't matter how many trees we cut down. We're divorced from that. It doesn't matter about mining into the earth and taking the blood of the earth, which is basically gas and oil. That's her blood, and there's going to be no consequences for that. For clear cutting and destroying forests and trees and crops, and for cows and too much of everything, overabundance of everything, overabundance of people. This is the earth, and she's gonna respond. It's not if anymore, it's when. So we have to come back into balance, and that begins with ourselves, within.
And you were also talking about, and thank you for that, because that's really beautiful and an expression of way of really appreciating the male and the female, and also herself as the planet and the goddess energy. As you were talking about abundance and food, is there such thing as a Wicca diet? Is there a Wicca feast? I always go back to food.
There's plenty of Wiccan feasting. There's plenty of Wiccan feasting. That is part of our celebration, our monthly full moons. You keep asking me about practices. We have monthly full moons. We have monthly new moons. When I say we, there's millions of people around the world that practice this alone. They have their own, or they have a partner and they do it at home, or they belong to groves or circles or covens even, or they go to pagan gatherings, and that's where there's a lot of feasting and people come together, and usually you celebrate with something called cakes and ale, which is after you've raised your energy or come together to worship and to raise energy towards a certain purpose. Say people in your community need healing, then you would break it down and give thanks and have food and ale or food and water or something to that effect. So
That's sort of interesting. Let's say I were to visit you, and I know that you and your partner are about to open up a community, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But let's say I was to go and visit and participate in one of the practices, participate in a ritual, participate in a worship service, if you will. Tell me how that would look like. The moment I walk in, what would I be walking into? What would I see? What would I experience from beginning to end?
that's a great question. We would gather in a circle, and we would invoke the elements. We would invoke the directions. We would most likely cleanse the space and you with some form of either incense or an ablution using waters. And then we would call in the ancestors, because this is a tradition where we honor our ancestors. Your ancestors, my ancestors, whoever is present, their ancestors are important, and the ancestors of the land are important. Because you have to honor the people that came before where we stand. And then we would call in and invoke God and Goddess. Some people are very specific about that. For me, it's usually God and Goddess. We would probably raise energy through singing. We might dance. Chris loves to dance.
Chris is your partner.
He is my partner, and he's here. And we would... And at that point, if there was a reason, if we were doing a holiday celebration, we might say some words specific to that holiday. If it is a monthly celebration, we would probably have a purpose that we were working on in our lives. As I said, it's a practical tradition. Somebody needs to get a new job. Somebody needs to get a new home. Somebody needs their family's sick. That's when you would raise that energy and speak that to the universe. After that, we would probably continue with either a meditation or drumming or some kind of sound raising. And then we would give thanks to all those assembled, including spirit people and God and Goddess. And we would proceed to close the circle. And that would be what our ceremony would look like.
And that could last for an hour or a half hour?
It could
2
be
hours?
very short,
Okay.
or it could be very long, depending on the people assembled and what you're trying to do.
And how do I show up? Because we in these conversations, we've spoken to different traditions where they say, come on in, you're always welcome. And we've spoken to other traditions that have said, no, you're actually not welcome to come in for these reasons. So let's say Jose and I just wanted to show up. Do we just show up? I want to get a new house, or I want to do something. How do I just call you one day, say, hey, I'd like to stop by, or how does that work?
That is an excellent question, and it's important too, because you're right. In some mystery traditions that if you aren't initiated into that particular tradition, it is a closed tradition, and I think Lukumi is more closed than that, for its own reasons. But Wicca, because it's a reconstruction, it's very open. Pagan tradition is very open. I think that you would probably want to know somebody and you'd be invited in. And that's because of people still have such crazy ideas about it that they would feel like if they don't know somebody, so they're going to come in and preach, are they going to ruin the circle? Are they going to ruin the energy? So it's you would be invited in and you would come as you are. I think for me, I'm not big on, you have to wear ceremonial robes, but some people are. Some people like the theater and the pageantry of it, and they enjoy that. I mean, we tend to wear our regular clothing, but if we're at if we go to a gathering where there's a lot of people for holidays, it's fun to get dressed up.
Of course.
It's fun to get dressed up.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit. We have a little more time left, but I do want to hear about your new center and where it is and what you're doing, and how we could show up if we wanted to, and what that would look like also for our listeners and our viewers.
I would love that. Thank you so much. Yes, so my partner Chris and we just moved up to Kingston, New York, and we are we're in Ulster, which is halfway between Kingston and Woodstock, and we bought some land, and we have a little house and some structures on it, and we plan to have a space there. It's called Soul Blossom Center.
Say that again.
Soul Blossom Center. The blossoming of soul and consciousness. And this is a vision I had when I graduated One Spirit as an interspiritual minister, that I wanted to found a center. And it's a place for healing. It's a place for connection with the land and with spirit. We're going to have classes and workshops. I'm going to teach probably a monthly moon circle, and I will call it a grove, which is a looser grouping of coming together to learn from one another, teach Wicca, teach pagan tradition, teach herbalism, teach things like that, and learn from others. It's not just about me, and really have a space for people to worship. And that will be for full moons and holidays. And we're also going to be having spiritist weekly meetings, and that is a different tradition that I practice. That's more about connecting with, understanding the spirit world, and we're going to be meeting there for that too.
That's great. And we're going to be studying that at another time in Open Harbor Conversations.
Great.
We're going to go more into that tradition coming up later in the year, or early next year as well. And again, I know we have a few more questions for you, but I want to make sure for those who are listening who go, this is very interesting. I never knew about this before. It's really opening up, and it's taking some of the fear or some of the questions out. You mentioned some resources, but if I go, okay, I'd like to learn more, and maybe I'm not in New York and I can't get to your center. What are some other resources for people?
There are Wiccans and pagans throughout the country, and other types of paganism include heathenism, which is very popular today. That's based on the Norse traditions. But there are people all over the country there, and the world. There's people in England, a lot of people, being that was one of the rebirthing places, and even in South America and stuff. But the resources that I would recommend, there's the Wild Hunt, which is a online journal. There's Pathos, I believe, has a pagan section with people that talks about places and people that are doing things. They had a great article on pagan gatherings, and I would highly recommend, if people are interested in finding out more, that's a great place to really meet people, practice the tradition, and meet somebody in your area that can teach you. Because I do believe that it's better to learn from somebody in the old-fashioned way, where it's traditional for a year and a day that you're going to study with a teacher who's going to, and in some people assemble in covens. They do have covens. I was initiated into the Sylvan Grove back in 1994. And that's where you would meet people in your area. There used to be and I'm not sure if the journal is still active, but it's called Witchbox as well. And that's broken down into areas that will give people resources and groups that are meeting regularly, that they could attend a full moon or a holiday gathering with people.
I like that. I just wanted to ask one thing, because you said the training or the initiation is a year and a day. Mm-hmm. I'm fascinated by the day. But then what am I initiated into?
You would be initiated into a Wiccan tradition, one of them. There's many. And you would train under a priest or a priestess. Most people consider themselves priestesses or priests in this tradition. And there's many different traditions, everything from Celtic, which is the tradition I was initiated into, to more formal, which are the Gardnerians and the Alexandrians, who are the naked ones. And then there's Dianic witches that really just focus on the goddess. Many of them are lesbian covens or female only, but there's gay and lesbian covens. There's more kitchen witch style people that practice more green witchery or herbalism. People that practice like strega, it's the Italian witchcraft, and it is witchcraft. Those of us who've been in this tradition for a long time, like me, we're not afraid of the word. It's the craft. The craft is the practice of the religion.
Reverend Wendy, what exactly has this given you? You entered into this, you have been initiated in 3 different traditions. It's been a significant amount of time, 30 years. What has what has Wicca brought into your life?
It's such a part of me. I mean, I discovered it, and I self-dedicated when I was 19 years old. I trained when I was at that age. I went to witch camp, and I told my parents, like, what are you doing? And I went to Circle Sanctuary in Wisconsin, and I studied under Selena Fox. I was with her for a couple of weeks, I think. I think it was 10 days or something like that. But she just opened my mind to the idea of the goddess is alive and magic is afoot, and helped me to realize that that's real, and to allow me to use my imagination to create the life that I wanted. It's given me a structure in my life. It gives me that balance of being able to go within and refill my own cup. It gives me tools to manage my life, a calendar that every holiday I can reconnect with nature in a new way that is meaningful to my outer world, my community, and my inner world as well. And it's just helped me grow. You know, it's become part of me for a long time. And like I said, I went through a period of my life where I kind of stepped away from it. I got really turned off by things that I was seeing. And I went through this difficult, dark night of the soul in my 30s. And I said, am I going to go back to church? Do I need to make peace with Christianity, etc.? And I actually did for a while. And I realized pretty quickly that I had outgrown that tradition. Not that I judge it, but I made peace with Jesus. But I just realized that it was too infused with patriarchy, and I really need the goddess in my life. At that time, I initiated into Lukumi, which was about 15 years ago. I started my journey with that, and I didn't really know what I was going to do and what I was going to call myself. I'm like, what am I now? And I got this clear message that you are everything that you have practiced has made you who you are. And that's when I found One Spirit. It was right after that, after I fully initiated. And at that time, they told me, because you get something when you're initiated as a priestess in Lukumi, is called an Ita, which tells you your past, your present, and your future. And what's the best way for you to practice your faith, or this faith, or whatever you're practicing. And it was told to me that I have to make sure that I practice both those traditions, because I've made commitments. And that's a commitment to the earth. And that's where the activism comes in. You know, it inspires me to be an activist, to care about the earth, to care about the planet, to care about civil rights, to care about people really coming back into balance, you know.
Right. Let me ask you, this is what it's given to you. When you think of Wicca and you think of the modern world, what are the 2 or 3 great lessons or gifts that Wicca has for the modern humanity?
The gift is that you too can awaken to your connection, to our interconnection, our absolute dependence, not only on the earth, but on one another. That, when the bees are threatened, that threatens us all. Mm-hmm. When the oceans rise, it's going to affect us all. So Wicca is that pathway for people who have a reverence for the earth and really don't want to see us and really realize what we've done by cutting ourselves off, So I think that for many, in this technology world where everybody's staring at their screen all the time, we don't even talk to each other anymore. It's going to be a practice back. It's a practice, Jose. That's the most important thing that I want to say. It's a practice of your life to make it a priority that you're going to take your shoes off and connect with the earth.
It also sounds like it's a practical practice, a term that we use around here a lot, of really something that you can apply, the singing and the dancing. And you had mentioned...
and the creativity. You said 3 things. I think that it gives us creativity to create and to really believe again in things that are beyond ourselves. It gives a kind of freedom, The goddess is very present. I mean, if we want to think about her today, I want to say, go down the river a little bit. She's standing in the harbor with holding a light of freedom. I always love the Statue of Liberty because that is a feminine deity. Mm-hmm. And that liberty is what people all around the country, all around the world right now are striving to be free. You know, it's this sense of freedom and power that you can take onto yourself by just really becoming a whole person, by embracing both your male and your female side.
Yeah.
You know?
And we had Dr. Dale Irvin here, who you also know, I'm aware, and he was talking about with Christianity that was the women who actually started taking it out. So it is again that balance, and also what I'm hearing you're saying is that it's a practice. It's a practice, and it's really bringing this all together. And at the end of the day, whatever we call it, if we look at a lot of the great traditions, as we find, there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of consistency. We might call it something else, but it's really choosing what you've dedicated yourself to, or what anyone's dedicated themselves to, and practice it. Mm-hmm. Let it work through them, because we're all connected.
Definitely, and there's second and third generation pagans and Wiccans today. You know, there's children being brought up in this tradition, which is going to change it. And they come up with a different relationship to the earth and to nature and to one another that's a lot more open and life-affirming. And it also inspires that side of them and their ability to create, you know. So I just see it as a positive for the earth. It's also a healing for people that are that have been disconnected from their ancestors, and that was done over many centuries. You know, it's not something that will be erased right away, but it's a healing in our psyche to connect with the idea that, you know, we are light and dark. We do have male and female. There is, you know, there's nothing wrong with some of the practices.
Yeah.
Well, it's a pleasure to do this with you, Reverend Heather Shea and Reverend Wendy Van Allen. Thank you so very much. This was magnificent.
Thank
it
you.
will not be the last time you're here.
I would love to come back, and I'm really honored to be here. So thank you very much, and blessed be, and merry meet and merry part and merry meet again.
Absolutely.
We are the same people, wiser than before.